The last person to see Dr. Marcus Williams alive was a jogger who passed him at 6:47 a.m. on Maple Street. Security cameras captured him turning the corner toward Oakwood Park. He never came home. What Harold Thompson found buried in his backyard proves that someone has been living with a terrible secret for 11 years. Before we start, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest true crime investigations. Sarah Williams woke up that Tuesday morning in March 2013 with no idea it would be the last normal day of her life. The coffee maker gurgled to life at exactly 6:15 a.m., same as every morning for the past 8 years of their marriage. Marcus was already stretching in the living room, his tall frame silhouetted against the bay window that overlooked their quiet Oakwood Heights neighborhood. "You're up early today," Sarah mumbled, padding into the kitchen in her fuzzy slippers. She watched her husband through the doorway as he bent forward, touching his toes with the fluid grace of someone who'd been an athlete long before he became a doctor. "Got that conference call with the pharmaceutical reps at 9, Marcus called, back, not breaking his stretch routine. "Figure I'll get a good run in before the day gets crazy." Sarah smiled to herself as she poured 2 cups of coffee. Even after all these years, she loved watching him prepare for his morning jogs. There was something almost ritualistic about it. The way he'd check his watch, adjust his running shoes just so, and stretch each muscle group for exactly 30 seconds. Dr. Marcus Williams was nothing if not methodical. At 34, Marcus was the youngest department head Mercy General Hospital had ever appointed. His colleagues respected him, his patients adored him, and Sarah couldn't have been prouder. They'd met during his residency when she was working as a pharmaceutical sales rep, and she'd been drawn to his quiet confidence and genuine desire to help people. "Don't forget we're having dinner with my parents tonight," Sarah reminded him, handing him his travel mug. Black coffee, no sugar, no cream. Marcus groaned playfully. "Your mother's going to ask when we're giving her grandchildren again, isn't she?" "Probably." Sarah laughed, standing on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek. His skin was warm and smelled like the sandalwood soap she'd bought him for Christmas. "Just smile and nod. Works every time." Marcus checked his fitness watch, a top of the line, Garmin that tracked everything from his heart rate to his sleep patterns. Sarah had bought it for him last birthday, tired of him constantly borrowing her stopwatch from the kitchen. "I'm thinking 8 miles today," he said, taking a long sip of coffee. "Maybe push it to 10 if I'm feeling good. Haven't done a long run since last weekend." Sarah nodded absently, already thinking about her own day ahead. She had 3 client meetings scheduled, including a big presentation to the cardiology department at St. Mary's. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd probably see more doctors today than her doctor husband would. "Be careful on Oakwood Trail," she called as Marcus headed toward the garage. "Mrs. Henderson said she saw some sketchy guys hanging around the park entrance yesterday morning." Marcus paused at the doorway, his hand on the light switch. "What kind of sketchy guys?" "I don't know. Probably just homeless people looking for somewhere to sleep. You know how she exaggerates." Sarah waved dismissively. "Just keep your eyes open, okay? Always do." Marcus winked at her, that same charming smile that had made her fall in love with him 7 years ago. "Love you, babe. Love you too. Don't be a hero if you see anything weird." Those were the last words Sarah Williams ever spoke to her husband. Marcus grabbed his keys from the hook by the door and headed into the garage. His running gear was laid out exactly where he'd left it the night before. Navy blue shorts, moisture-wicking shirt, and his lucky running shoes that had carried him through 3 marathons. He changed quickly, stuffing his wallet and house keys into the small zippered pocket of his shorts. The garage door rumbled open, revealing a crisp March morning. The temperature was perfect, cool enough to prevent overheating, but warm enough that he wouldn't need a jacket. Marcus stepped outside and took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the clean suburban air. He started with a light jog down Maple Street, waving to Mrs. Chen as she retrieved her newspaper from the driveway. She waved back with a smile, the same routine they'd shared for years. Marcus loved the predictability of these morning runs. the way the neighborhood slowly came to life around him. As he approached the corner of Maple and Oak, his watch beeped. 1 mile completed in 7:42. Right on pace for a good workout. He turned right toward Oakwood Park, passing the small strip mall where Sarah bought their groceries and the coffee shop where they'd had their first date. The morning was unusually quiet, even for a Tuesday. Most of the commuter traffic wouldn't start for another hour, and the only other person he could see was another jogger about half a block ahead of him, moving in the same direction. Marcus picked up his pace slightly, his breathing steady and controlled. This was his meditation time, when all the stresses of the hospital, the difficult diagnoses, the insurance battles, the politics of hospital administration, seemed to fade away. Out here, he wasn't Dr. Williams, head of internal medicine. He was just a guy running through his neighborhood, feeling his body do what it was designed to do. As he approached the park entrance, Marcus noticed a white van parked along the curb. It wasn't unusual. Contractors and landscaping crews often worked in the area. But something about it caught his attention. The engine was running, and he could see someone sitting in the driver's seat, though the tinted windows made it impossible to make out any details. He made a mental note to mention it to Sarah later, not because he was particularly concerned, but because she'd been worried about Mrs. Henderson's sketchy guys, and Marcus had learned that paying attention to his wife's instincts usually saved him trouble later. The other jogger, a woman, in bright pink running gear, passed him going the opposite direction. She nodded politely, and Marcus raised his hand in the universal runner's greeting. For a moment, he considered turning around and striking up a conversation. He'd been thinking about joining a local running club and meeting other serious runners. In the neighborhood seemed like a good start, but his watch beeped again, mile 2 completed, and Marcus decided to stick to his planned route. He had a long day ahead of him, and the conference call with the pharmaceutical reps was important. They were discussing a new treatment protocol that could potentially help dozens of his patients. He turned left into Oakwood Park, following the paved trail that wound through the trees. The path was well maintained and popular with local fitness enthusiasts, though at this early hour, Marcus had it to himself. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the asphalt ahead. This was always his favorite part of the run, the section where he could really open up his stride and find his rhythm. His breathing settled into a steady pattern, his feet finding their cadence on the familiar path. Miles 3 and 4 always felt effortless when he hit this groove. Behind him, the white van's engine continued to idle. Marcus never saw the 2 men who stepped out. Sarah's phone rang at 11:30 a.m., right in the middle of her presentation to the cardiology team at St. Mary's. She glanced at the caller ID, Mercy General Hospital, and felt a flutter of annoyance. Marcus knew she had this important meeting today. Whatever crisis had come up at the hospital would have to wait. She declined the call and continued explaining the benefits of the new blood pressure medication her company was introducing. The cardiologist, Dr. Patterson, seemed genuinely interested, asking detailed questions about side effects and drug interactions. This was exactly the kind of engaged discussion that led to successful partnerships. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Then another. And another. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her professional smile wavering slightly. "Would you mind if I take just a quick look? My husband works at Mercy General, and they usually don't call unless it's important." Dr. Patterson nodded understandingly. "Of course, take your time." Sarah picked up her phone, expecting to see a message from Marcus about a patient emergency or a scheduling conflict. Instead, she found 3 increasingly urgent texts from Dr. Jennifer Hayes, Marcus's colleague and close friend. 11:28 a.m. "Sarah, is Marcus with you? He missed his 9 a.m. conference call and isn't answering his phone." 29 a.m. "This isn't like him. His first patient appointment was at 10:30 and he never showed. Where is he? 11:31 a.m. "Sarah, please call me back immediately. Something's wrong." The colour drained from Sarah's face. In 8 years of marriage, Marcus had never missed a scheduled appointment. He was compulsively punctual, the kind of person who arrived 50 minutes early to everything and considered being on time as being late. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said to Dr. Patterson, already gathering her materials. "I need to make a phone call. This is very unlike my husband." She stepped into the hallway and dialed Jennifer's number with shaking fingers. "Sarah, thank God," Jennifer answered on the first ring. "Where's Marcus? Please tell me he's with you." "He's not," Sarah said, her voice tight with growing panic. "He went for his morning run around 6:45. He was supposed to be back by 8:30 for his conference call. What do you mean he missed his appointments?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Sarah could hear the controlled concern in Jennifer's voice when she spoke again. "Sarah, I think you need to come to the hospital. Now." "Jennifer, you're scaring me. What's going on?" Marcus didn't just miss his conference call. He missed everything. 3 patient appointments, 2 consultations, and a department meeting. His patients are sitting in the waiting room, and no one knows where he is. This isn't like him, Sarah. This isn't like him at all. Sarah's legs felt weak. She leaned against the hospital wall, her mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe he'd gotten injured during his run. Maybe he'd had an accident. Maybe his phone had died, and he was stuck somewhere, trying to get help. "Have you called the police?" Sarah asked. "I was hoping you'd heard from him first. But Sarah, I think we need to report this. Something's wrong." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to think rationally. Marcus was responsible and reliable to a fault. If he wasn't at the hospital, if he wasn't answering his phone, if he'd missed appointments he'd never miss, something had definitely happened. "I'm coming to the hospital," Sarah said, "and I'm calling the police on my way." She ended the call and immediately dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hit the numbers. "911, what's your emergency?" "I need to report a missing person," Sarah said, the words feeling surreal as they left her mouth. "My husband left for a morning run 6 hours ago and never came home. He missed all his appointments at work. This isn't like him at all." The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but we typically require a person to be missing for 24 hours before we can file a missing person report, unless there are extenuating circumstances." "Extenuating circumstances?" Sarah's voice cracked. "My husband is a doctor who has never missed a single appointment in his entire career. He left for a jog this morning and disappeared. What more extenuating circumstances do you need?" There was a brief pause. "Ma'am, what's your husband's name, and where was he last seen?" "Dr. Marcus Williams. He left our house at 6:45 a.m. for his regular jogging route through Oakwood Heights. The route takes him down Maple Street and through Oakwood Park. I'm going to connect you with Officer Rodriguez. He'll take your information and send a patrol car to check the area. Can you meet them at your home address?" Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that someone was finally taking this seriously. Terror at the reality that police were now involved in finding her husband. "Yes, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Sarah rushed back into the conference room, barely coherent as she apologized to Dr. Patterson and gathered her things. Her hands were shaking so badly that she dropped her business cards twice, scattering them across the polished table. "Is everything all right?" Dr. Patterson asked, his medical training kicking in as he noticed her pale complexion and obvious distress. "My husband is missing," Sarah said, the words still feeling impossible. "I'm sorry, I have to go." She didn't wait for his response, rushing out of the hospital and toward her car. The 20-minute drive home felt like hours, her mind cycling through every possible scenario. Maybe Marcus had gotten turned around on an unfamiliar trail. Maybe he'd stopped to help someone and lost track of time. Maybe he'd run into an old friend and they'd gone for coffee. But even as she tried to convince herself of these benign explanations, Sarah knew in her heart that something terrible had happened. Marcus didn't get lost. He didn't lose track of time. and he certainly didn't abandon his responsibilities without explanation. When she arrived at their house on Maple Street, a police cruiser was already waiting in the driveway. Officer Rodriguez was a middle-aged Hispanic man with kind eyes and a reassuring presence. He introduced himself and asked Sarah to walk him through Marcus's normal routine. "He leaves at the same time every morning?" Officer Rodriguez asked, taking notes in a small pad. "Usually between 6:30 and 7 hours a.m., depending on his schedule. Today, he left at 6:45 because he had an important conference call at 9 hours. And his normal route?" Sarah pointed down the street. "He jogs down Maple Street to Oak, then into Oakwood Park. Usually does a loop through the park trails, then comes back the same way. It's about 6 miles total. Takes him roughly 45 minutes to an hour depending on how hard he pushes himself." Officer Rodriguez nodded. "Has he ever deviated from this route before? Maybe explored new trails or extended his run?" "Sometimes he'll do longer routes on weekends, but never on weekday mornings. He's very scheduled about his workouts." Sarah's voice caught slightly. "Officer, this really isn't like him. Marcus is the most responsible person I know. He wouldn't just disappear without telling someone." "Ma'am, I believe you. That's why we're taking this seriously, despite the normal 24-hour waiting period. I've already radioed for additional units to check the park area and the surrounding neighborhoods." As if on cue, Officer Rodriguez's radio crackled to life. Sarah couldn't make out all the details, but she heard Oakwood Park and no sign, and felt her heart sink further. "They're checking the trails now," Officer Rodriguez explained. "We'll also canvass the area, talk to neighbors who might have seen him this morning." Sarah nodded, though she felt like she was watching this conversation happen to someone else. This morning, she'd been worried about a sales presentation and dinner with her parents. Now she was discussing search procedures for her missing husband. "Mrs. Williams, I need to ask you some questions that might seem personal, but they're standard in these situations. Was your husband having any problems at work? Any financial difficulties or personal conflicts?" Sarah shook her head immediately. "No, nothing like that. Marcus loves his job. We have no money problems, no enemies. He's well respected at the hospital and in the community." "Any recent changes in his behavior? Seemed stressed or worried about anything?" Sarah thought back over the past few weeks, searching for any signs she might have missed. "No, if anything, he's been really happy lately. He just got promoted to department head a few months ago, and he's been talking about us starting a family soon." Officer Rodriguez made another note. "I'm going to need a recent photo of your husband and a detailed description of what he was wearing when he left this morning." Sarah fumbled for her phone, scrolling through photos until she found a recent one of Marcus at a hospital charity event. He was smiling broadly, wearing his favorite navy suit, looking exactly like the successful, happy man she'd married. He was wearing navy blue running shorts, a grey moisture-wicking t-shirt, and white running shoes with blue accents, Sarah recited. The details burned into her memory from watching him get dressed just hours earlier. "Any identifying features? Scars, tattoos, jewelry?" "He has a small scar on his left forearm from when he was a kid, and he always wears his wedding ring and his fitness watch, a black Garmin." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "Officer, where could he be? What could have happened to him?" Officer Rodriguez's expression was compassionate but professional. "Mrs. Williams, there are many possibilities, and most missing person cases resolve quickly with the person returning safely. But I want you to know that we're treating this seriously, and we're going to do everything we can to find your husband." As they spoke, Sarah noticed their elderly neighbor, Harold Thompson, working in his garden across the street. Harold was in his late 70s, a retired mechanic who spent most of his time maintaining the most beautiful yard in the neighborhood. He was always outside early in the morning, tending to his plants or puttering around his garage. "Harold might have seen Marcus this morning," Sarah said suddenly. "He's always outside early, working in his garden." Officer Rodriguez looked where Sarah was pointing. "Good thinking. Let's go talk to him." They crossed the street, and Harold looked up from where he was kneeling beside a flower bed, his weathered hands covered in soil. "Morning, Sarah," Harold said, then noticed the police officer. His expression grew concerned. Everything all right? Harold, this is Officer Rodriguez. We're looking for Marcus. Did you see him leave for his run this morning? Harold's face immediately grew serious. He wiped his hands on his pants and stood up slowly, his arthritis making the movement difficult. I sure did. Saw him come out of the garage around 6:45, maybe a few minutes before. He waved to me like he always does. Harold paused, thinking. Actually, now that you mention it, there was something a little different this morning. Sarah felt her heart skip. Different? How? Well, there was this white van parked down the street. Didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was contractors or something. But the engine was running, and someone was sitting in the driver's seat. Seemed odd for that early in the morning. Officer Rodriguez pulled out his notepad again. Can you describe the van? Make, model, license plate? Harold shook his head apologetically. Afraid I can't help much there. My eyes aren't what they used to be. It was white, maybe a Ford or Chevy work van. I didn't get close enough to see the license plate. Which direction was Dr. Williams heading when you last saw him? Same direction he always goes, down toward Oak Street, heading for the park. That's his regular route. Officer Rodriguez thanked Harold, and they returned to Sarah's house. The PSI officer immediately radioed the information about the white van to the units searching the area. Mrs. Williams, I'm going to be honest with you. The presence of an unfamiliar vehicle with someone waiting inside changes the nature of this investigation. We're going to expand the search and bring in additional resources. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. Up until this moment, she'd been clinging to the hope that Marcus had simply gotten hurt or lost. The idea that someone might have deliberately taken him was almost incomprehensible. You think someone took him? Sarah whispered. I think we need to consider all possibilities, Officer Rodriguez said carefully. But Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that we have excellent detectives working missing person cases, and we're going to find out what happened to your husband. As if summoned by his words, another police car pulled up to the house, followed by an unmarked sedan. Sarah watched as more officers approached her front door, their faces serious and professional. Detective Lisa Chen introduced herself as the lead investigator on the case. She was a small woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an authoritative presence that immediately made Sarah feel like she was in capable hands. Mrs. Williams, I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but I need to ask you to walk me through everything again, from the beginning. Sometimes details emerge when we go through the story multiple times. Sarah nodded, though part of her wanted to scream that talking about it wasn't going to bring Marcus home. But she understood that cooperation was the only way to help find him. So she started over, describing their normal morning routine, Marcus's predictable habits, and her growing panic when the hospital called. You mentioned that your husband had a conference call at 9 a.m. Was this a routine call or something special? It was with pharmaceutical representatives about a new treatment protocol. Marcus had been looking forward to it all week. He thought the new medication could really help some of his more difficult cases. Detective Chen made a note. And you said he never misses appointments or commitments. Never. Marcus is incredibly reliable. Even when he was sick with the flu last year, he still made it to work for his essential appointments. He would never, just not show up without calling. Detective Chen exchanged a look with Officer Rodriguez. Mrs. Williams, we're going to need to search your house and your husband's office at the hospital. It's standard procedure, and it might help us understand if there was anything unusual happening in his life. Sarah nodded, though the request felt like another step away from normal life and deeper into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. There's something else, Detective Chen continued. We'd like to access your husband's phone records and credit card activity to see if there's been any unusual activity. Of course, whatever you need. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's house filled with police activity. Officers searched through Marcus's belongings, looking for anything that might provide a clue about his disappearance. They went through his computer, his files, his medical journals, treating their home like a crime scene. Sarah sat in her kitchen, watching strangers rifle through her husband's life, feeling helpless and increasingly terrified. Every hour that passed without word from Marcus made the situation feel more dire. At 4 p.m, Detective Chen approached her with an update. "Mrs. Williams, we've completed our search of the park area and the surrounding neighborhoods. We haven't found any sign of your husband, but we did find something interesting." Sarah's heart jumped. "What?" "We found his fitness watch." Detective Chen held up a clear evidence bag containing Marcus's black Garmin watch. The band was broken, and there was a small crack across the display. "Where did you find it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "On the trail in Oakwood Park, about 2 miles from the main entrance. It was partially hidden under some brush, off the main path." Sarah stared at the watch, her mind trying to process what this meant. Marcus never took off his fitness watch during runs. He was obsessive about tracking his workouts, his heart rate, his pace. For the watch to be broken and discarded meant that something violent had happened. "Mrs. Williams, I need to prepare you for the possibility that your husband may have been the victim of a crime." Sarah nodded numbly, though hearing the words out loud made everything feel more real and more terrifying. "We're treating this as a potential abduction case now. We're bringing in additional resources, including the FBI if necessary. We're also going to need you to stay available for more questions as the investigation develops." "I'll do whatever you need," Sarah said. "I just want him back." Detective Chen's expression softened slightly. "We're going to do everything we can to find him, Mrs. Williams. But I need you to understand that this investigation may take time and there may be difficult moments ahead." Sarah looked around her house, now filled with evidence tags and the lingering presence of the search. Just this morning, she'd been kissing her husband goodbye and worrying about dinner with her parents. Now she was living in a police procedural, trying to understand how her stable, predictable life had turned into a nightmare in the span of a few hours. Outside, she could see Harold Thompson still working in his garden, unaware that his casual observation about a white van might be the most important clue in finding Marcus. The normalcy of the scene, an elderly man tending his flowers on a quiet suburban street, felt almost surreal against the backdrop of the investigation consuming her house. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine Marcus walking through the front door, apologizing for worrying her, explaining that he'd gotten injured on the trail and his phone had died. But when she opened her eyes, the broken fitness watch was still sitting in the evidence bag on her kitchen table, and her husband was still missing. The nightmare was just beginning. Chapter 3. The long search days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, but Marcus Williams remained missing without a trace. Sarah's life became a series of police briefings, search parties, and sleepless nights spent staring at her phone, hoping for news that never came. The story made local headlines first. Prominent doctor disappears during morning jog. Then it spread to regional news outlets as the search expanded beyond Oakwood Heights. Sarah found herself giving interviews, pleading for information, holding up the same photo of Marcus at the charity event, the one where he looked so happy and alive. Detective Chen became a regular presence in Sarah's life, updating her on the investigation's progress, which seemed to consist mostly of dead ends and false leads. The white van Harold had seen was never located, despite an extensive search of local security cameras and traffic footage. The broken fitness watch yielded no forensic evidence beyond confirming that it had been damaged in some kind of struggle. "These cases are marathons, not sprints," Detective Chen explained during one of their weekly meetings. "We're still actively investigating, still following up on tips, still searching." But Sarah could see the subtle changes in the detective's demeanor as time passed. The urgency was still there, but it was tempered by the reality of a case growing cold. Fewer officers were assigned to the search. The FBI involvement that had been promised never materialized beyond some initial consultation. The department's resources were necessarily divided among newer cases with fresher leads. Sarah threw herself into her own search efforts. She organized volunteer search parties every weekend, coordinating with local hiking groups and community organizations to comb through areas the police might have missed. She created a Facebook page, Find Marcus Williams, that grew to over 10,000 followers, sharing his photo and story with anyone who would listen. She learned to navigate the strange world of missing persons advocacy, connecting with other families dealing with similar tragedies. There was a whole community of people whose loved ones had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions and grief. Sarah found both comfort and heartbreak in these connections. The hardest part was the not knowing. If Marcus was dead, she could grieve and eventually try to move forward. If he was alive somewhere, she needed to keep searching, keep hoping, keep believing that he might come home. The limbo was torture, but giving up felt like abandoning him. Marcus's colleagues at Mercy General initially rallied around Sarah, offering support and help with the search efforts, but as months passed and life moved on, their calls became less frequent, their offers of help more perfunctory. People meant well, but they had their own lives to live, their own problems to solve. Dr. Jennifer Hayes remained Sarah's closest connection to Marcus's professional life, but even she eventually suggested that Sarah might want to consider seeing a grief counselor. "I'm not ready to grieve," Sarah had said. "He's not dead, he's just missing." But the distinction felt increasingly meaningless as the first anniversary of Marcus's disappearance approached. Sarah had kept their house exactly as it was the morning Marcus left for his run. His coffee mug still sat in the dishwasher. His running clothes were still in the hamper. His side of the bed remained untouched, though Sarah had long since stopped sleeping there, finding the master bedroom too painful to occupy. She'd taken a leave of absence from her sales job, using their savings to support herself while she focused on the search. The pharmaceutical company had been understanding at first, but eventually they needed to fill her position. Sarah didn't care. Her career felt meaningless without Marcus there to share her successes and failures. On the first anniversary of his disappearance, Sarah organized a vigil in Oakwood Park. About 50 people showed up, neighbors, colleagues from the hospital, members of the running club Marcus had never gotten a chance to join. They lit candles and shared memories, and Sarah spoke about her husband's dedication to his patients and his love for their community. Detective Chen attended the vigil, standing quietly at the back of the group. Afterward, she approached Sarah with a familiar mixture of sympathy and professionalism. "How are you holding up, Mrs. Williams?" Sarah almost laughed at the question. How was she holding up? She was surviving, barely, existing in a state of suspended animation while waiting for answers that might never come. "I'm fine," she lied, because the truth was too complicated to explain. "I wanted you to know that we're still working the case. It's not cold, not officially. We're still following up on leads, still hoping for a breakthrough." Sarah nodded, though she wondered what leads could possibly remain after a full year of investigation. She'd heard about all of them, the reported sightings in other states that turned out to be other people, the tips from psychics and well-meaning but misinformed citizens, the theories about witness protection programs and voluntary disappearances. That never held up under scrutiny. "Mrs. Williams, I have to ask you something, and I want you to know there's no judgment in the question. But have you given any thought to the possibility that Marcus might not be coming home?" Sarah had been asked this question before by well-meaning friends and family members who thought she needed to move on or find closure. But hearing it from Detective Chen felt different, more official, more final. "Every day," Sarah admitted, "but I can't live as if he's dead when I don't know that he is. What if he's somewhere, waiting for someone to find him? What if he's trying to get home and can't? What if giving up is exactly the wrong thing to do?" Detective Chen nodded understandingly. "I've worked missing persons cases for 15 years, and I've seen families deal with this uncertainty in many different ways. There's no right or wrong approach, Mrs. Williams. You have to do what feels right for you." As the second year began, Sarah's search efforts became more focused, but also more desperate. She hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Robert Kane, who specialized in cold cases. Kane was expensive, money Sarah couldn't really afford, but he brought fresh eyes to the investigation and a willingness to explore theories the police had dismissed. Missing person cases usually fall into a few categories, Kane explained during their first meeting. Voluntary disappearance, accidental death, suicide, or foul play. Based on everything I've read about your husband, voluntary disappearance and suicide seem extremely unlikely. Sarah appreciated Kane's direct approach. He didn't sugarcoat the realities or offer false hope, but he also didn't suggest that she should give up. That leaves accidental death or foul play. If it was accidental, say he fell into a ravine or got lost in the woods, we would have found some trace of him by now. The search was thorough, and it's been 2 years. Bodies surface, clothing gets found, evidence emerges. So you think someone took him? Sarah asked. I think it's the most likely scenario. The question is who and why. Your husband didn't have enemies, didn't owe money, wasn't involved in anything dangerous. So either this was a random crime of opportunity, or there's something about Marcus's life that we don't know yet. Kane spent months re-interviewing witnesses, reviewing evidence, and exploring angles the police investigation had overlooked. He discovered that Marcus had been working on a research project involving new cardiac medications, and he wondered if there might be some corporate espionage angle. He looked into Marcus's patient files, searching for anyone who might have held a grudge. He even investigated the possibility of medical malpractice revenge, though Marcus's record was spotless. None of these leads produced results, but Sarah appreciated having someone actively working on the case. Kane's monthly reports gave her something to focus on, a reason to believe that progress was still possible. By the 3rd year, even Kane began to run out of new avenues to explore. Mrs. Williams, I've been as thorough as I know how to be, he said during one of their meetings. I've re-examined every piece of evidence, re-interviewed every witness, explored every theory I can think of. I'm not saying we should give up, but I am saying that we might need to wait for new information to emerge. Sarah understood what he was really saying. The case had gone as far as investigation could take it, without fresh evidence or new witnesses. They were stuck, just like the police had been. But Sarah wasn't ready to stop. She continued organizing search parties, though fewer people participated each year. She maintained the Facebook page, though the comments and shares dwindled over time. She kept Marcus's missing person posters updated and visible around town, though business owners grew tired of displaying them. The 4th anniversary vigil was smaller than the first, maybe 20 people instead of 50. Detective Chen still attended, but she looked older, more tired. The case had taken a toll on everyone involved. Sarah had been seeing a therapist for the past year, finally accepting that she needed help processing her trauma and grief. Dr. Amanda Foster was a specialist in ambiguous loss, the unique pain of not knowing whether a loved one was dead or alive. Closure is overrated, Dr. Foster often told her. What you're looking for isn't closure, it's answers. And there's nothing wrong with wanting answers, but you also have to find ways to live with uncertainty. Learning to live with uncertainty was the hardest thing Sarah had ever attempted. It meant accepting that she might never know what happened to Marcus, while still believing it was worth trying to find out. It meant grieving someone who might still be alive, while hoping for a reunion that might never come. By the 5th year, Sarah had developed a routine that allowed her to function while still honoring her commitment to finding Marcus. She returned to work part-time, taking a position with a smaller pharmaceutical company that was more flexible about her need for time off when leads emerged. She moved out of their house on Maple Street, finding the daily reminders too painful, but she kept it as a rental property in case Marcus ever came home. She still organized an annual vigil, though it had become more of a personal ritual than a community event. She still maintained the Facebook page, posting updates even when there was nothing new to report. She still called Detective Chen every few months, checking in on the case that everyone else seemed to have forgotten. Mrs. Williams, Detective Chen said during one of these calls in Year 6, I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll understand why I'm telling you this now. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. After all these years, she'd learned to recognize the tone that preceded difficult news. I'm retiring next month. Detective Morrison will be taking over your husband's case, and I've briefed him thoroughly on everything. We know. Sarah thanked Detective Chen for her years of service, but privately she felt like she was losing her last connection to the official investigation. Chen had been there from the beginning, had seen Marcus's broken watch, had interviewed Harold Thompson about the white van. Morrison would be starting from case files and reports, without the personal investment that came from being there when it all began. As the years passed, Sarah began to notice changes in how people talked about Marcus. Instead of asking if there was any news about the search, they asked how she was doing, how she was healing, whether she'd considered dating again. The questions weren't meant to be hurtful, but they revealed a shift in perception. Marcus was no longer a missing person who might be found. He was a tragedy from the past that people expected her to move beyond. Sarah's family and friends meant well, but their suggestions that she move on or start living again missed the fundamental reality of her situation. She wasn't frozen in grief or refusing to accept reality. She was actively choosing to remain available for Marcus in case he needed her, in case he found a way to come home, in case new evidence emerged that could lead to answers. But as the 10-year anniversary approached, even Sarah had to acknowledge that the chances of Marcus being alive were virtually non-existent. If he had been kidnapped, held somewhere, forced into some kind of captivity, surely there would have been some sign, some evidence, some demand for ransom. The complete absence of any contact or clues suggested a finality that Sarah had spent a decade refusing to accept. Dr. Foster helped her understand that accepting Marcus's likely death didn't mean giving up hope for answers. You can believe that he's gone while still working to understand what happened to him, the therapist explained. One doesn't negate the other. The 10th anniversary vigil was the smallest yet. Just Sarah, Harold Thompson, now in his 80s but still tending, his garden, Dr. Jennifer Hayes and Detective Morrison, who had inherited the case from Chen. They stood in the same spot where Marcus's fitness watch had been found, lighting candles and sharing memories of a man who had simply vanished from their lives without explanation. I want you all to know, Sarah said to the small group, that I'm not giving up. I may never know what happened to Marcus, but I'm not going to stop looking for answers. Harold Thompson spoke up in his creaky voice. Sarah, honey, you've been the most dedicated wife a man could ask for. Marcus would be proud of how you fought for him all these years. After the vigil, Sarah and Harold walked back toward Maple Street together. Harold moved slowly now, his arthritis making every step difficult. But he still insisted on maintaining his garden, still spent his mornings outside in the fresh air. You know, Harold said as they paused at his front gate. I think about that. I'm mourning a lot, about that white van and whether I should have paid more attention to it. Sarah had heard Harold express this regret many times over the years. He felt responsible for not getting a license plate number or a better description of the vehicle. Sarah had always tried to reassure him that he'd done nothing wrong, that there was no way he could have known that Marcus was in danger. Harold, you've been more help than you know, Sarah said. Your testimony about the van was the most important clue in the entire investigation. Harold nodded, but Sarah could see the guilt still weighing on him after all these years. I just wish I could have done more, he said. Wish I could have prevented it somehow. As Sarah watched Harold make his way slowly up his front walk, she realized that Marcus's disappearance had affected everyone in the neighborhood, everyone who had known him. They all carried pieces of guilt and regret, all wondered if they could have done something different that morning. But Sarah also realized something else. Harold Thompson was one of the last direct connections to the day Marcus disappeared. He was in his 80s now, and while he seemed healthy, he wouldn't be around forever. When Harold was gone, there would be no one left who had actually seen Marcus that final morning, no one who remembered the details of that day with the clarity of personal experience. The thought filled Sarah with a sense of urgency she hadn't felt in years. Time was running out, not just for finding Marcus, but for preserving the memory of what had happened to him. Chapter 4. Harold's Garden. 11 years after Marcus Williams disappeared, Harold Thompson decided it was time to plant tomatoes. At 78, Harold had been maintaining the same garden routine for decades, but this spring felt different. His arthritis was getting worse, making it harder to kneel and dig. His doctor had suggested he consider moving to a senior living community where he wouldn't have to worry about yard maintenance. Harold's children, scattered across the country, had been dropping increasingly frequent hints about selling the house and moving closer to family. But Harold wasn't ready to give up his independence, and he certainly wasn't ready to abandon the garden that had been his pride and joy for over 40 years. So when April arrived with its promise of new growth and fresh beginnings, Harold decided to undertake one last major gardening project, a vegetable garden in the back corner of his bay yard. He'd always grown flowers, roses, tulips, daffodils, the kind of ornamental plants that made his neighbors stop and admire his yard. But vegetables were different. Vegetables were practical. At his age, Harold appreciated the idea of growing something he could actually eat, something that would sustain him through the summer months when his appetite often flagged in the heat. The back corner of his yard had been unused for years, covered with an old tarp and some pieces of scrap wood left over from a fence repair project he'd completed back in 2019. Harold had always meant to clean up the area, but there had never been any urgency to do so. Now, with his new tomato garden project, the space suddenly had a purpose. Harold started the project on a Monday morning in mid-April, when the temperature was cool enough for sustained physical activity, but warm enough that the ground had thawed completely from winter. He moved slowly and methodically, the way he approached all his projects these days, taking frequent breaks to rest his back and joints. First, he removed the tarp and scattered wood pieces, stacking them neatly by his garage for eventual disposal. Underneath, the ground was compacted and hard, covered with several years' worth of decomposed leaves and debris. Harold spread a layer of compost he'd been preparing all winter, then began the slow process of turning the soil with his spade. The work was harder than he'd anticipated. His arthritis made it difficult to grip the shovel handle for extended periods, and his balance wasn't what it used to be. Several times he had to stop and sit on an old lawn chair, catching his breath and massaging his aching hands. But Harold was determined. This garden represented something important to him, a refusal to give in to age and infirmity, a commitment to remaining active and productive for as long as possible. Every shovelful of turned earth was an act of defiance against his children's suggestions that he was too old to live alone. By Tuesday afternoon, Harold had cleared and tilled about half of the planned garden area. He was making good progress, though the work was taking longer than he'd hoped. As he dug, he encountered the usual obstacles: rocks, tree roots, the occasional piece of buried trash that had somehow ended up in his yard over the decades. Most of these objects were easily removed or worked around, but on Wednesday morning, about 3 feet down in the northwest corner of the plot, Harold's shovel struck something that didn't belong there. At first, he thought it was a large rock or maybe an old tree stump that had been buried years ago, but as he cleared away the soil around it, Harold realized he was looking at something manufactured, something that had been deliberately placed in his yard. It was a metal box, about the size of a small suitcase, made of what looked like stainless steel or aluminum. The surface was scratched and tarnished from years underground, but the box appeared to be intact. There was a handle on one side and what looked like a simple latch mechanism on the front. Harold sat back on his heels, staring at the box and trying to understand how it had ended up buried in his yard. He'd lived in this house for over 40 years, and he'd never buried anything in this corner of his property. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who'd moved to Florida in the early 1980s, and Harold couldn't imagine them burying a metal box in their backyard either. His first thought was that it might be some kind of time capsule, perhaps buried by neighborhood children decades ago and forgotten. Harold remembered stories of kids in the 1960s and 70s burying collections of toys and memorabilia, planning to dig them up years later, but never following through. But as Harold examined the box more closely, he noticed that it wasn't the kind of amateur burial a child would have attempted. The box was positioned precisely, buried at a depth that would require significant effort to excavate, and covered in a way that suggested deliberate concealment rather than playful time capsule creation. Harold's curiosity was overwhelming, but his practical nature made him hesitate. The box clearly wasn't his, and opening it felt like a violation of someone else's privacy. But at the same time, it was buried on his property, and he had every right to investigate what was in his own backyard. After several minutes of internal debate, Harold decided to bring the box inside and examine it more carefully. He brushed off the excess soil and carried it to his kitchen table, surprised by how heavy it was. Whatever was inside, it was substantial. The latch was corroded, but still functional. Harold worked it carefully, not wanting to force anything, and potentially damage whatever was inside. After several minutes of gentle manipulation, the latch gave way with a soft click. Harold lifted the lid slowly, not sure what to expect. Inside, wrapped in several layers of heavy plastic sheeting, were items that made Harold's blood run cold. The first thing he saw was a wallet, a brown leather bifold that looked familiar, though Harold couldn't immediately place where he'd seen it before. Next to the wallet was a cell phone, an older model smartphone that had been turned off for years. Underneath these items was a set of car keys, a fitness watch with a cracked display, and several pieces of jewelry including a wedding ring. But it was the driver's license in the wallet that made Harold's hands shake as he realized what he'd found. The license belonged to Dr. Marcus Williams. Harold stared at the ID photo, his mind racing as he tried to process the implications of his discovery. Marcus Williams, the young doctor who had disappeared 11 years ago while jogging through the neighborhood. Marcus Williams, whose wife Sarah had spent more than a decade searching for answers. Marcus Williams, whose disappearance had haunted Harold because he'd been one of the last people to see him alive. Harold's hands were trembling as he continued examining the contents of the box. The fitness watch was definitely Marcus's. Harold remembered seeing him wear it during his morning runs. The wedding ring was engraved with initials and a date that Harold assumed marked Marcus and Sarah's anniversary. But there were other items in the box that Harold didn't recognize. Several vials of what looked like medication or drugs, each labeled with handwritten codes that meant nothing to Harold. A small digital camera that was too old to turn on. A notebook filled with what appeared to be medical terminology and dates. And, at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a separate plastic bag, was a single sheet of paper covered in handwriting. Harold's eyes weren't good enough to read the text clearly, but he could make out enough to understand that it was some kind of confession or explanation. Harold sat at his kitchen table for a long time, staring at the contents of the box and trying to understand how they had ended up buried in his yard. He'd lived in this house for 4 decades, and he'd never seen anyone digging in his backyard. He would have noticed someone burying a box, especially one buried as deeply as this had been, which meant that someone had buried the box without his knowledge, probably at night, probably years ago when Harold's hearing and vision were better, and he might not have noticed someone in his yard. Someone had used Harold's property to hide evidence of what had happened to Marcus Williams. Harold's first instinct was to call the police immediately. This was clearly evidence in a missing person case, and it needed to be turned over to the authorities as quickly as possible. But Harold found himself hesitating, not because he wanted to keep the evidence, but because he realized the implications of what he'd found. If Marcus's personal effects were buried in Harold's yard, it meant that whoever had taken Marcus knew where Harold lived. It meant that the person responsible for Marcus's disappearance had been in Harold's backyard, had violated his property, had made him an unwitting participant in whatever had happened. Harold thought back to that morning 11 years ago when he'd seen Marcus jogging down Maple Street for the last time. He remembered the white van parked along the curb, the person sitting in the driver's seat. He'd always assumed that the van had been connected to Marcus's disappearance, but he'd never imagined that the person in that van had known exactly where to hide the evidence afterward. The realization made Harold feel sick. For 11 years, he'd been living directly above the buried remains of Marcus Williams' life. never knowing that his garden was concealing the truth about what had happened to his neighbour. Harold picked up his phone to call 911, but then he stopped. There was one person who deserved to know about this discovery before the police, before the media, before anyone else got involved. Sarah Williams had spent 11 years searching for answers about her husband's disappearance. She deserved to be the first to know that those answers had been buried in Harold's backyard all along. Harold found Sarah's phone number in his old address book. She'd given it to him years ago in case he ever remembered anything else about the morning Marcus disappeared. Harold had never used the number, but he'd kept it all these years just in case. His hands shook as he dialed, not sure how to explain what he'd found or how Sarah would react to the news. "Hello?" Sarah's voice sounded tired, though it was only mid-afternoon. "Sarah, this is Harold Thompson from across the street." There was a pause, and Harold could hear the surprise in Sarah's voice when she responded. "Harold, is everything okay?" "Sarah, I need you to come over to my house right away. I found something in my yard that you need to see." "Found something? What do you mean?" Harold took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I've been working on a garden project, digging in my backyard, and I found a box buried in the ground. Sarah, it has Marcus's things in it." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that Harold wondered if the call had been disconnected. "Harold." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "What did you say?" "I found Marcus's wallet, his keys, his watch. They were buried in a metal box in my backyard. Sarah, I think we found the evidence everyone's been looking for." Harold could hear Sarah breathing heavily on the other end of the line, and he worried that the shock might be too much for her. "I'm coming over right now," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "Don't touch anything else. Don't call anyone else. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Harold hung up the phone and sat staring at the contents of the metal box spread across his kitchen table. In 10 minutes, Sarah Williams would walk through his front door and see her husband's belongings for the first time in 11 years. Harold had no idea how to prepare for that moment, how to help Sarah process what they'd discovered, how to handle the emotional weight of finally having answers to questions that had consumed her life for more than a decade. But Harold knew one thing for certain. This discovery was going to change everything. The case that had gone cold years ago was about to become active again. The neighborhood that had slowly forgotten about Dr. Marcus Williams was about to remember. And somewhere out there, the person who had buried this box in Harold's yard was about to discover that their secret was no longer safe. Harold looked out his kitchen window toward the house where Marcus and Sarah had lived, where Sarah had waited every day for 11 years for her husband to come home. In a few minutes, she would walk through Harold's front door and finally learn the truth about what had happened to the man she'd never stopped looking for. The truth that had been buried in Harold's backyard all along. Can you imagine living for 11 years not knowing what happened to someone you love, only to discover the truth was buried right across the street? Let us know in the comments what shocked you the most about Dr. Marcus Williams' case. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on because part 2 is coming soon.